aspects of National Socialism, the Nazis. The history of the Third Reich abounds with cultic comparisons, including the godlike worship of a leader, the stifling of dissenting opinions, the demand for slavish self-sacrifice from the members, and the devotion to a spellbinding leader whom the rest of the world recognized as a charlatan and a clown. Hitler was probably the most successful cult leader in history. All of these elements are well known to historians, but the factor that's often overlooked in the history of Nazism is the degree to which the leaders of Nazi Germany relied upon pseudoscience, the occult, and magical thinking to justify their actions. And in this paper, I'll delineate those occult factors, examine the techniques that Hitler and his allies used to achieve a countrywide state of mind control, and draw a cautionary parallel with modern-day politics and cult leaders. As with most modern-day cult leaders, Hitler and his staff used symbols, rituals, and magical thinking to point to their own invincibility, the inevitability of their predictions, and the historical justifications for their actions. The book Revelations, chapter 20, 1-3, offers the classical formulation for the reign of God's anointed over the earth. The devil will be seized and imprisoned, and the faithful will reign for 1,000 years before the final battle. It is not a coincidence that Hitler often spoke of the establishment of the Third Reich that would last for 1,000 years. The humiliation that the Germans felt after World War I, the astonishing runaway inflation, the history of German authoritarianism are often cited as explanations for why Germany was ripe for the acceptance of Nazism, but these explanations are inadequate. As often happens during times of great deprivation, alienation, and impotence, the population searched for magical answers. The catalyst that ignited these factors was the sacred science of the pseudoscientific explanations to the inevitability of the ascendancy of the Aryan people, the acceptance of absurd explanations for the state of the world, and the ironclad promise that power was about to shift, just like in modern-day cults. Himmler and Hitler believed that the lost continent of Atlantis was the original home of the Aryans, and they accepted Madame Blavatsky's speculation that this civilization had been swept away in the first deluge 850,000 years ago. More about Madame Blavatsky later. The Aryan Atlanteans were a race of supermen, Ubermenschen, who had developed the ability to use their third eyes to discern other people's thoughts and motivations. They were a race of physical and spiritual giants whose size could be measured by noting the size of the stone statues on Easter Island. Because of the discovery of the psychic link with those ancient Aryans, many Germans believed that the Aryan people were inexorably fated to win World War I. And the only plausible reason for how they could possibly have lost that war was that they were stabbed in the back by powerful forces of darkness. Jews have been scapegoated many times in history, but in Germany between the wars, the search for the betrayers coincided with the rise of mysticism and the occult. For example, there was a rise in the belief in Gnosticism, a philosophy which claims that there are two realms, the spiritual realm ruled by God versus the evil material realm ruled by Satan. Many modern-day cultists continue to discount reality as only the machinations of an insignificant, corrupt, evil material world, while what's of real importance is the spirit world. Gnosticism held that Jehovah, the God of the Hebrew Bible, was the God of this material world. The debased Jewish people worshiped this material God. And the Jews, through their worship of this God, practiced black magic. For example, they could control the weather, so droughts were their fault. Another philosophical stream between the wars was the bastardization of Darwin's theory of evolution. Some theorists distorted Darwinism to claim that the natural evolution of mankind was towards the ideal, that is, the Aryans. What was impeding this evolution was the Jehovah-worshipping Jew who was polluting the gene pool. Jews were sex-obsessed satyrs, hungry to mate with pure Christian women. Since bad blood drives out good, a Jew who mates with an Aryan woman could only create depraved Jewish children. This was proof beyond dispute that the natural and scientific advancement of the human race was being impeded by the Jews. It was therefore an action on the side of humanity for this group of people to be massacred. It was inevitable that there would be a race war between the forces of good and the forces of evil decadence. The forces of good had to win, and many writers after World War I predicted the emergence of a Superman who would be a reincarnated ancient warrior. One of the philosophers who foreshadowed the Nazis was Madame Polina Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian expatriate countess who founded the Theosophical Society in New York City in 1875. Tony mentioned these theosophists. She published her first book, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888, the year before Hitler was born. Blavatsky wrote of the ancient races who had esoteric knowledge and superhuman powers. In esoteric teaching, including Blavatsky's, the relationship between the master and the disciple is immutable. The disciple must obey all of the master's directives, no matter how absurd and irrelevant they seem, even if these commands violate his own conscience. The master has knowledge which is beyond the ken of the disciple, and the disciple's conscience misleads him. Does that sound familiar when we think of modern-day cults? Exalted historical examples of groups with esoteric knowledge and superhuman capabilities are the assassins of 11th century Islam and the thugs of 13th century India. An occultist named Guido List Germanized Blavatsky. List also introduced the swastika as a symbol of Aryan power. Whereas Blavatsky rewrote history, List rewrote geography, claiming that Blavatsky's ancient race of superhuman were from Germany. Now, all of these spiritual paths were the coin of the intellectual realm between the wars. It was said that you couldn't walk down the street in Vienna in the 1920s without coming across a fortune teller. This was the atmosphere of Hitler's young adulthood. Before I talk about Adolf Hitler's belief in the occult, I want to talk about the beliefs of his closest advisors. Almost every one of Hitler's top command were resolute occultists. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, studied the rantings of Nostradamus, although it appears that he was more interested in Nostradamus' technique of saying nothing in a way that made it sound like it was profound. He frequently had astrologers predict the outcome of German projects. Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess also employed an astrologer who told him when the propitious times were for him to travel. He was a strong believer in pseudoscience, and his life was ruled by astrology, soothsayers, homeopathy, telepathy, and other forms of divination. But perhaps no one on Hitler's staff was more focused on the occult than Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the Gestapo, and the author of The Final Solution. Himmler, a chicken farmer, was convinced that he was the reincarnation of King Henry the Fowler, the king of Germany, from 919 to 936. Himmler was a follower of Hans Herberger, who taught that objective science is a pernicious invention, a totem of decadence. Instead of relying on science and history, Herberger demanded that people seek enlightenment and study the mythology that aggrandized the pure Aryans. Himmler established the Ancestral Research Branch of the SS to subsidize occult research into the ancestral origins of Aryanism. When the British secretly broke the secret German Enigma code, Himmler was convinced that the British maritime successes was because they had diviners who could swing a pendulum over the map to find the exact location of his U-boats. Himmler berated his generals for not exploring similar stratagems. And when Mussolini was captured, Himmler had his coterie of generals dividing over maps of the world to try to find where it was. Because he was so convinced of the propriety of his actions, Himmler devised techniques of manipulation and mind control in order to achieve the kinds of outcomes that we recognize in modern-day cults. He compelled his SS stormtroopers to ignore their own humanity, and he justified murder as a utopian idealism. Those whom he controlled were taught to renounce their former ambitions and to subjugate themselves to the greater good, the creation of a pure Aryan master race. For example, he set up breeding camps for unwed young women in the Hitler Youth so that they could become impregnated by SS troopers. These Lebensborns were a chain of maternity homes which saw to the unwed mothers and provided homes for their children. When young girls would agree to give themselves over to these camps, they were first asked, who is going to have a baby for the Fuhrer? And they were praised and rewarded if they presented the Fuhrer with a child. The SS itself was an occult society, and Himmler was able in a short period to change SS recruits from ordinary citizens to mass murderers. The stormtroopers were, at least consciously, motivated not by sadism, but by the call to personal sacrifice in a fanatical utopian cause, which demanded that they leave their old decadent worlds behind them. The SS were the prototypes of the new man. They were the first stage in superhuman mutation. They behaved as if they were supermen, but they also exhibited a robot-like quality that is familiar to modern-day cult observers. They were fearless and cruel, but they were simultaneously cringingly subservient to their leaders. They were encouraged to spy on each other and to denounce anyone who was not strictly following doctrine. The ideal was called cadaver. I was able to pronounce it this morning. Cadavergehorsam. Cadavergehorsam. Unthinking, unhesitating, cadaver obedience. This was the ideal. They participated in repeated acts of consecration and the pledging of total commitment to their new community. The ideal was unconditioned liberation from their old social world of caste, class, and family. They were now a part of a new community with new alliances and a new morality. Again, sounds familiar. Their families of birth were significant only as long as they fully supported the transformation which was taking place. I'd now like to turn to a brief history of Adolf Hitler and his involvement with these occult beliefs and practices. In 1908, when he was 20, Hitler moved to Vienna and applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, which rejected him twice. He then moved to a homeless shelter in the city's slums. Those that knew him described him as lonely, shy with women, moody, and given to frequent violent outbursts, a behavior that's not unknown in modern-day cult leaders. Vienna, I mentioned at that time, was undergoing tremendous changes. In the 40 years from 1860 to 1900, the city's population had grown 259%. Europe at that time was obsessed with spiritualism, and Vienna was a home to astrologers, mediums, and necromancers who claimed to be able to communicate with the dead. In Vienna, Hitler became enthralled by a magazine called Astara, which was an occult, anti-Semitic German nationalist magazine. Hitler read every one of its issues and kept all his old copies for reference. Despite having no money, Hitler made no attempt to find steady work. He would occasionally draw the buildings or the bridges of Vienna and sell them. A friend described him as having inspirational ideas but lacking the ability to follow through on any of them. He demanded that others agree with his ideas, and he would display a temper tantrum when they didn't. And again, does that not sound like every cult leader you've come across? Hitler had a passion for reading, and although he lacked academic training, he voraciously read racist, nationalist, anti-Semitic material and would preach to the other men at the homeless shelter where he lived for 2 years. In 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Germany. When World War I broke out in 1914, Hitler claimed in Mein Kampf that he sunk to his knees and thanked God for being alive. He enlisted in the German army, and it was while he was in the army that he claimed to have begun to gradually recognize that it was he who was the savior that Germany was destined to find. He claimed that he was saved by bullets and shells by divine intervention. For example, once when he was in the foxhole eating a meal, he heard a voice telling him to leave. He did so, and minutes later, the area where he had been sitting was hit, killing all the men who were there. On another occasion, he claimed to have come face to face with a British soldier who was aiming his rifle right at Hitler's face. Hitler claims that he stood his ground and stared down the soldier, who lowered his rifle and allowed the future Führer to escape. And most cult leaders have miraculous stories of themselves and things that they have noticed or that have happened to them. After World War I, the German people were disheartened by their loss. Although there was a strong strain of anti-Semitism in Germany for many years before the war, this hatred took on a new dimension as the Jews were blamed for the loss of the war. At one point, Hitler was sent by the authorities to spy on an organization called the Thule Society. They adopted a shout, Sieg Heil, which meant Hail Victory, and the Thule Society changed their name to the German Workers' Party, and then they consolidated all the anti-Semitic groups into one organization called the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazis. At first, Hitler did not proclaim himself to be the Messiah. That changed after the Munich Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, when some members of the German government were meeting in a Munich beer hall. Nazis surrounded the building and on a signal rushed in, declared that the revolution had begun and that the government was deposed. The putsch failed and Hitler was imprisoned for 9 months. While there, he wrote Mein Kampf with the help of Rudolf Hess. In November 1932, Hitler's lover, Eva Braun, attempted suicide, and that same week the Nazis lost seats in the election for the Reichstag. Hitler contemplated suicide, but met an astrologer named Erich John Hanussen, who told him that in 30 days there would be a turning point. Hanussen told him that in the town where Hitler was born, there was a mandrake root that had magical qualities. And Hanussen traveled to Brunau am Inn in Austria, where Hitler was born. He dug up the mandrake root. Mandrake roots are like ginseng roots, which are so favored by the Unification Church and other groups, because when they grow with parts out like this, and they get split, and they can resemble a human being. Hanussen gave Hitler the root and told him that if he honored the bond between them, there would be a change of fortune. 30 days later, through a series of occurrences, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. 1 month later, on February 26, 1933, Hanussen had led a seance in which he again predicted that there would be a fortunate event that would befall Hitler. The next day, the Reichstag was burned down. The Nazis, who most historians believe started the fire themselves, blamed the socialists whom they found on the premises for the fire. A series of decrees were passed, and the Nazis were given authority to annihilate their enemies. Later that year, the Thule Society, which Hitler had joined and which eventually became the Nazis, published a book called Before Hitler Came, which explained Hitler's ideas and that they had originated with the Thule Society. Hitler was outraged because he claimed that he was influenced by no one and had invented himself. He ordered that all copies of the book be burned, and on June 30th, 1934, Nazi henchmen killed Hanussen, the astrologer who had saved Hitler when he had suicidal thoughts, because he wanted nobody to believe that he had any roots other than himself. Over time, Hitler's portrayal of himself became more outlandish. In 1934, he saw himself as a human. From 1934 to 1938, he portrayed himself as a Superman. And from 1938 on, he saw himself as beyond human and a tyrant. Like modern-day cults, the Nazis employed a sacred science. In World War II Germany, astrologers, necromancers, and purveyors of witchcraft and sorcerers were everywhere. They said that theirs was a science that the experts did not understand because it was the science of the future. Eric Hoffer, the philosopher, said that mass movements provide a new life with elements of pride, confidence, hope, and purpose through identification with a holy cause. They also provide a suitable outlet for the pent-up rage of the followers, much of which is the result of the Kadafergersum, the subjugation of the followers to the leaders. He also pointed out that a mass movement can exist without a God, but it can't exist without a devil. And that devil might be Satan, or it might be non-believers, or it might be Jews, or it might be other people who are weak and different, like immigrants. After World War I, the German people were devastated, and now with the rise of Nazism, there was certainty. As long as a German followed the rules, all that was permitted, rage without guilt or boundary, relief from responsibility, the knowledge of his people's superiority. There is no more ambiguity. He can say, as Hermann Göring did, I have no conscience. Adolf Hitler is my conscience. It is not I who live, but the Führer who lives within me. This paragraph could have been spoken about any modern-day cult leader. Hitler, like modern-day cult leaders, who demand that his followers commit mass suicide when they feel themselves to be threatened, did not know where he ended and the German people began. When the American and Russian troops were outside Berlin and he knew that he was doomed, he ordered that all food and clothing stores, all bridges and dams, all military, industrial, communication, and transportation facilities in the country were to be destroyed. His orders were that any German who tried to stop this total demolishment of the German nation was to be killed. I want to read that again. As Hitler was facing his own death, he demanded that all food and clothing stores, all bridges, all dams, all military facilities, all industrial facilities, all communication facilities, all transportation facilities in the country were to be destroyed. If he was going down, the German nation could not continue to exist. His order came too late and it was not carried out. All roads lead to somewhere. When a fanatical organization, be it a cult, a society, or a political party, believes that they and only they have unique answers to all mankind's problems, it becomes their responsibility to eradicate all other belief systems for the good of humanity. To the children of Germany between the wars, the Hitler youth leaders became surrogate parents. They offered solidarity and certainty in a fragmented society. If we believe absurdities, we can commit atrocities. Mainstream people in Germany laughed at Hitler at first. They saw him as a clown who would never come to power because his ideas were so absurd. I will end by drawing some parallels with present-day politics. We must beware of demagogues who don the mantle of patriotism by stoking emotions and fears and then trumpet racism and broad classifications of people who would wall off others who are different, who offer simplistic, thought-terminating cliches as solutions to complex problems. When an election devolves into a three-ring circus, there's always the chance that the dancing bear may